Following Good Friday, we now come to Black Saturday. Many Christians throughout the ages have actually referred to this day as Silent Saturday or the Saturday of Silence. Why is that? Why would Christians refer to this day as a day of silence? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. When you look at the New Testament and you read through the gospel narratives, you find that there's really not much said about the day between Jesus' death and his resurrection. There's only a few details that we know about this day. So for instance, in Matthew 27, in verse 62, we start to find that the religious leaders were beginning to conspire and come up with a plan. So they come to Pilate and they ask him that the tomb where Jesus had been laid would be guarded. So they knew that Jesus had claimed that on the third day he would rise from the dead. And so, oddly enough, on the Sabbath day, they begin to coordinate with Pilate. I think Matthew actually includes that detail about this conversation happening on the Sabbath for a reason. He wanted to point out their hypocrisy. What else do we know about this day? Well, when we go to the disciples and begin to look at their actions on this day, Luke is the only one who comments. In Luke 23, verse 56, we find that the disciples were resting. They had decided to observe the commandment of the Sabbath. And that's really all that we know from the biblical text about what was happening on this day. Now, I think there's a couple more assumptions that are probably fair to make. I think we can all agree that there was mourning on this day. Certainly there was fear. I think we can rightly conclude that there was doubt, there was uncertainty. In fact, when we begin to look at what happened on the very next day, on Resurrection Sunday, we see that the women were coming to Jesus' tomb in order to anoint his body. Doesn't seem like they had any expectation of a resurrection. They weren't really anticipating the fact that they were going to find that tomb empty. In fact, we even see that some of the women suspected Jesus' body had been stolen when they arrived at the tomb. And when we look at the disciples and we start to observe their actions on that Resurrection Sunday morning, we see that they too were confused and somewhat baffled by the empty tomb. We'll talk about this more tomorrow, but we see they were confused when they arrived and found the tomb empty. I think all of this demonstrates that Saturday, that day of Sabbath rest, was a day filled with far more questions than there were answers. There were far more tears than there was laughter. I think we can fairly assume that there was far more fear than there was hope. So what should we make of this? How should we think about the disciples' reaction to the death of Jesus? What should we make of their confusion and their fear? I would argue, for one, that I don't think it's an easy question to answer. We might think it is. We might want to be quick to hurl accusations at the disciples and blame them for their breach of faith, which, sure, it seems like they had a breach of faith, but I think that's a bit too simplistic. Don't minimize the fact that they had just lost their teacher, their rabbi, and their friend. These men and these women were hurting. You see, death is not something that is easily disregarded as unimportant or insignificant because we have the hope of the gospel. I think of Jesus on his way to Lazarus' tomb. Even though he knew what he was about to do, he approaches the tomb with tears in his eyes. As we see in the book of John, he wept over his friend. You see, I think that Jesus' disciples, sure, they had forgotten a thing or two about what Jesus said regarding his resurrection that was coming, but let's not reduce their tears to merely a lack of faith. There's more going on here. You see, as Christians, I think we can fall into a a ditch and fool ourselves into thinking that there is no place for weeping or mourning or pain in a time of loss. We have the hope of the resurrection after all. But the pain is real when you lose someone you love. It's hard, if not impossible, to stop the tears when you stare at a casket. You see, death demonstrates that this world is not as it should be. And the hope of the gospel is not meant to eliminate that sensation. You see, we constantly find ourselves, even today, living in that Saturday, the Black Saturday in which the disciples found themselves. Sure, we have the hope of the gospel, but the pain is real. You see, Paul in Romans 8 actually addresses this very idea. So Romans 8 in verse 22, we see this. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. In other words, even the creation itself is demonstrating that things are not the way that they were meant to be. But as we keep reading, we find that there is hope on offer that will help us as we experience the groanings of this life. Look at verse 23. It says, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for we who hope for who hopes for what he sees. But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. The Christian experience is not void of pain. It's not void of heartache, not at all. But the Christian experience is different from the experience of those without the hope of the gospel. You see, the Christian hope is that we anticipate the resurrection. There is something on the other side of the pain that we are in the midst of right here and right now. We have something to look forward to. And this means that our experience is remarkably similar to the experience of those disciples on that Saturday. Our hurt is real, just like theirs. But so is our hope. It is real, just like theirs. Sunday morning is coming. Resurrection Sunday is on the way, and I'm not just referring to tomorrow. I'm referring to the day when Christ will return. He will gather us for himself, and we will be resurrected. We will be able to experience the hope for which we have been waiting. One day, that hope will be finally realized. And for now, we wait.